not in the shower. That's normally just singing anything. You know how it normally happens is I sit down with a guitar or a piano.
Paul McCartney spent decades hiding his true feelings about one woman. She walked into Beatles recording sessions in 1968 and destroyed everything. She used their instruments without permission. She broke their sacred guy thing rule. The other Beatles hated her presence too. Paul felt pushed aside as his best friend chose her over the band. In 2023, he finally confessed the uncomfortable truth. This woman didn't just break up the Beatles. She broke Paul's heart in ways no one understood. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, right in the middle of World War II. Liverpool was being bombed constantly by German planes, and families like his had to hide underground almost every night. His father, Jim, worked in cotton sales, while his mother, Mary, was a nurse at Walton Hospital, the same place where Paul was born. The family lived dangerously close to the docks, which were always under attack. When Paul was born, his father joked that he looked terrible, like a piece of red meat with one eye open, crying non-stop. That rough beginning during a time of bombs and blackouts shaped how Paul would see the world. When Paul was just 5 years old, he had already learned to fight. He remembered hitting a boy with a metal bar and getting told off in front of the whole school. He needed that toughness later, especially after passing the 11+ exam, which got him into the Liverpool Institute. But his success didn't make life easier because his mother was Catholic and his father was Protestant. He became a target. The other boys, mostly from Protestant families, bullied him harshly. Every day at school felt like a battle, and Paul learned to protect himself. These early struggles stuck with him and would later show up in songs that talked about survival and standing strong. Paul's toughest moment came in 1956. On October 31st, his mother died from breast cancer. She was only 47. Paul was just 14 and couldn't believe it. She had kept the illness a secret, and after surgery, she passed from a blood clot. Paul's first thought was heartbreaking. He asked what they would do without her money. Mary had been the main breadwinner. His last memory of her was teasing her for how she said the word ask, that guilt never left him. Just a few months later, he wrote his first song, I Lost My Little Girl, as a way to process his grief. That loss would stay deep inside him. And years later, when he dreamed of her telling him everything would be okay, it inspired one of his most famous songs, Let It Be. His father, Jim, was more than a salesman. He was a talented musician who played piano and trumpet. He had worked at the Hippodrome Theatre in Liverpool and learned music just by listening every night while running the spotlights. In 1957, Jim gave Paul a trumpet, hoping he'd follow in his footsteps. But Paul soon realized he couldn't sing and play trumpet at the same time, so he traded it for a guitar that cost £15. That simple choice completely changed music history. The guitar gave Paul a way to sing and create songs at the same time. His father's love for old music deeply influenced Paul's style, especially his fondness for strong melodies and catchy tunes. Even with school and music, Paul still had to work. In 1958, at age 16, he took on tough jobs just to help the family. He delivered coal during freezing mornings and swept floors at a cotton mill, where the machines were so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. His grandfather had spent his life cutting tobacco at Copp's warehouse, and his father had worked in Liverpool's cotton exchange. These experiences taught Paul about working people, their pain, pride, and humor. It was this world that shaped many of the Beatles' songs that honored everyday life. When Paul was 10 years old in 1952, something terrifying happened. He almost drowned while swimming with friends in one of Liverpool's flooded quarries. These deep pits looked fun, but were deadly. Filled with freezing water and leftover mining equipment, they were traps for children. Paul slipped under, and his friends had to pull him out. Many kids had died in those waters. That scare left him with a fear of swimming that stayed for life, and maybe even a stronger sense of how fragile life could be. Then came the day that changed everything. On July 6, 1957, Paul went to a church fete at St. Peter's in Woolton. It was hot and sunny. He watched a boy named John Lennon play guitar using strange chords he'd learned from his mom. Paul, who was left-handed, flipped John's guitar upside down and played 20 Flight Rock perfectly, singing every word. He also sang Long Tall Sally like a pro. The band couldn't believe it. He could play, sing, tune guitars, and knew all the hits. That moment was the beginning of a partnership that would shake the world. 2 weeks later, Pete Shotton saw Paul riding his bike and casually invited him to join John's band, the Quarry Men. Paul said he would after scout camp and a family holiday. His first real gig with the group came on October 18, 1957. Everyone wore matching jackets. They paid off slowly, bit by bit. What made this even more emotional was that John's mother, Julia, had died just 3 months earlier. Paul understood that pain. He had lost his own mother the year before. That shared grief brought them closer, and their music would carry the emotions they couldn't say out loud. By 1959, Paul and John were skipping school to write songs in Paul's bedroom at 20 Fortland Road. They sat face-to-face writing and recording ideas using a cheap tape recorder. Their first song together was Too Bad About Sorrows. Then came Just Fun, and an instrumental called Looking Glass. They treated songwriting like work, building a notebook filled with over 100 songs long before they were famous. This was the foundation of their future success. But not everything went smoothly. On that same first Quarry Men performance in October 1957, Paul had one job: play a solo on Guitar Boogie. He had practiced it again and again, but when the moment came, nerves got the better of him. He froze, stumbled through the song, and felt completely humiliated. He nearly quit music altogether, but instead of giving up, he decided he wasn't cut out to be a lead guitarist. That failure made him realize they needed someone better, which led to George Harrison joining in early 1958. That change would shape the band forever. In May 1960, Paul took on a stage name during a chaotic tour in Scotland. For 8 days, the band played behind singer Johnny Gentle. Paul called himself Paul Ramone, trying to sound fancy. They traveled in a cramped van, stayed in dodgy places, and weren't even listed on the posters. The tour was a disaster, but Paul remembered Scottish girls asking if that was his real name. Despite the mess, it gave him a taste of the road life. Then came Hamburg. On August 17, 1960, the Beatles began playing at the Indra Club in Germany's red light district. They performed for hours every night, 4.5 hours on weekdays and 6 hours on Saturdays. The place was full of strip clubs and rough crowds. They earned just a few marks each, barely enough for food. But this grind made them better. Club owners would shout at them to put on a show, and they did. John would act wild on stage, and they started developing a real performance style. George later said that Hamburg is where they truly became a band. During their time in Hamburg, Paul made a big decision. When Stuart Sutcliffe left the group in 1961, they needed a new bassist. Paul didn't want the role, but he took it anyway. He bought a Höfner violin bass from a local music shop. That bass became iconic. He used it on the band's early albums and singles like She Loves You. His melodic bass playing changed how people saw the bass guitar. It wasn't just background anymore. It became part of the song's heart. Everything shifted when they met Brian Epstein. On November 9, 1961, he saw them play at the Cavern Club and immediately thought they had something special. Just a few weeks later, on December 3rd, he offered to manage them. He had no experience, but his style and confidence impressed them. Their parents liked him too, and soon he was guiding the group towards something much bigger. The biggest controversy hit in August 1962. John invited Ringo Starr to join the band. Just 2 days later, Pete Best was out. Fans were furious. Some protested outside Pete's house, and George even got punched by an angry supporter. At Ringo's first recording session, the producer didn't trust him and used a session drummer instead. Ringo thought he might be kicked out too, but in the end, the new lineup clicked and it changed everything. Their first single, Love Me Do, came out on October 5, 1962. It didn't top the charts right away, but reached number 17 in the UK by November. Paul sang harmony and played bass, while John handled the harmonica. They recorded 3 versions with different drummers. When the song finally came to the US in 1964, it hit number 1. That was their 4th US number 1 hit in the same year, breaking records and launching them to global fame. It all began on February 9, 1964, when 4 young men from Liverpool stepped onto the Ed Sullivan Show stage and changed the world. That night, 73 million people were glued to their screens, setting a record that held for 3 years. CBS was flooded with 50,000 ticket requests, even though the theater only had room for 728 people. The moment became more iconic than Elvis's debut in 1957. During one song, as the camera moved across the band members, John's caption cheekily read, "Sorry girls, he's married." They opened with "All My Loving." Then Paul sang "Till There Was You," followed by "She Loves You," and later returned for "I Saw Her Standing There and I Want to Hold Your Hand." It all happened just 77 days after President Kennedy was killed, and somehow this joyful noise helped America start to smile again. By 1966, though, the cracks were showing. Manila turned into chaos when they missed an event with the Marcos family. Crowds attacked them, and Paul remembered kissing the plane seats when they finally escaped. By 1967, Brian Epstein was dead. The Magical Mystery Tour film had flopped, and strange rumors spread that Paul had died. And then, in 1968, Yoko Ono stepped into the studio and everything changed. For Paul, it wasn't just that she was there, it was how she acted. She sat beside John during takes, offered opinions, even picked up instruments. To the Beatles, the studio was sacred, a guy-thing space where only the four of them and producer George Martin belonged. Paul later said they all fumed in silence. They didn't say much, but they hated it. For Paul especially, it was more than awkward. He felt like Yoko was stealing John away from him. The Lennon-McCartney partnership that had carried him through grief, loss, and triumph was being undone by someone who didn't respect the unspoken rules. The White Album sessions were agony. Paul tried to keep control, but John tuned him out. Paul later said they all fumed in silence. They didn't say much, but they hated it. For Paul especially, it was more than awkward. He felt like Yoko was stealing John away from him. The Lennon-McCartney partnership that had carried him through grief, loss, and triumph was being undone by someone who didn't respect the unspoken rules. The White Album sessions were agony. Paul tried to keep control, but John tuned him out. George felt ignored. Ringo even quit for a short time. Paul recorded other people's parts, bossed them around, desperate to hold things together, but Yoko's constant presence widened the gap. He would never forgive her for it. Even after the breakup, the wounds didn't heal. Paul threw jabs in his songs. Too Many People was a thinly veiled attack on John and Yoko's preaching. John fired back with How Do You Sleep, which mocked Paul's entire career. Yoko herself dismissed Paul publicly, calling him jealous, saying John didn't need him anymore. For Paul, it wasn't just about the band. It was personal. He felt erased, replaced, pushed out of his best friend's heart. When John was murdered in 1980, Paul's complicated feelings didn't fade. He never got closure, never got to make peace, and his resentment toward Yoko deepened. She controlled John's legacy. She made deals, told stories, gave interviews, and Paul always felt she downplayed his role in the Beatles. They shared public stages, but the tension was visible. In 2023, in a rare admission, Paul finally said what he had held back for decades. It was never comfortable, and no one liked the way she interfered. For a man known for love songs, Paul McCartney carried one great hatred. Not for rivals, not for critics, but for the woman who sat down in the Beatles' studio in 1968 and changed everything. She didn't just break up the Beatles, she broke his heart. And that wound, even after all the music, the fame, the years, never fully healed. Paul's relationship with Yoko wasn't just about music, or even about John. It went deeper. To Paul, the Beatles were family. They had built each other up from boys in Liverpool with cheap guitars into the most famous musicians in the world. They had shared tiny hotel rooms, stage fright, hunger, exhaustion, laughs, secrets, and grief. They were more than a band. They were brothers. And Paul saw himself as the one who held the band together when things went wrong. He worked harder than anyone, driving them into the studio, pushing for perfection. He couldn't stand the idea of something, or someone, breaking that bond. Yet when Yoko arrived, suddenly John no longer treated the Beatles as sacred. Paul wasn't just losing a bandmate, he was losing his best friend. John started showing up late. He stopped caring about harmony in the studio. Yoko whispered in his ear, passed him notes, even argued with Paul directly about arrangements. Paul later admitted he felt ganged up on, isolated in his own band. The Lennon-McCartney partnership that had fueled hit after hit was unraveling in real time. Paul would walk into the studio, guitar in hand, ready to work on another masterpiece. John would sit silently, arms crossed, waiting for Yoko to speak. The balance of power was gone, and in Paul's mind, Yoko was the reason. He tried to keep his cool, to stay professional, but the cracks showed in the music. Listen to the White Album and you can hear it. The disjointed styles, the separate recording sessions. the sense that each Beatle was working alone. Paul pushed Obladi Oblada with cheerfulness, almost to the point of madness. John seethed, calling it granny music. George's frustration simmered as his songs were dismissed. Ringo, caught in the middle, simply walked out for 2 weeks. For Paul, every tense session was another reminder that his family was falling apart, and Yoko was always there, the one face he blamed most. It wasn't just artistic differences. Paul felt mocked. He heard Yoko criticize him, undermine him, suggest John didn't need him anymore. To the public, the Beatles were still the perfect unit, 4 mop-topped lads who brought joy to millions. Behind the scenes, Paul felt cornered. He later admitted he didn't know how to express his anger without looking petty. So he bottled it up, tried to outwork the tension, but the resentment grew. When the Beatles finally collapsed in 1970, Paul walked away not just from the band, but from the brotherhood that had defined his life. And at the center of his pain, he saw Yoko's shadow. Even after the split, Paul couldn't let it go. He poured his frustration into music. His 1971 album Ram contained barbed lyrics aimed at John and Yoko. Too many people included the sharp line about preaching practices, which John instantly recognized as a jab. John hit back with brutal force in How Do You Sleep, sneering that all Paul ever did was write silly love songs, mocking him as irrelevant without the Beatles. The cover art of Paul's single Another Day even featured a fly on a woman's face, which Yoko interpreted as an insult aimed directly at her. The feud spilled into interviews, headlines, and fan debates. To the world, it was rock gossip. To Paul, it was personal warfare. Privately, though, Paul still longed for John's approval. The same boy who had looked up to John back in 1957, who had worked tirelessly to match his wit and energy, still wanted that friendship back. He wrote letters, tried to reconnect, even showed up unannounced at John's New York apartment once. But Yoko was always there, the gatekeeper. Paul felt shut out. Every rejection deepened his bitterness. He wasn't just losing John to fame or drugs, he was losing him to her. And then came December 8th, 1980. John was shot outside the Dakota Building in New York. The news spread across the world like a shockwave. Fans wept in the streets. Paul was asked for a statement as he left a recording studio in London. His response, "It's a drag," came off cold, almost dismissive. What the cameras didn't capture was his private devastation. He cried alone, regretting every fight, every insult, every lost chance to make peace. And yet, even in his grief, he couldn't shake the thought that if John hadn't been so tied to Yoko, maybe they would have reconciled sooner. The tragedy froze their relationship forever in conflict. Paul was left with guilt, but also with that lingering resentment. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Paul rebuilt his life. He toured the world, raised his family, released hit albums, and cemented his legacy as a solo artist. Yet the ghost of John and the shadow of Yoko never left him. Whenever Beatles anniversaries rolled around, whenever journalists asked about the breakup, Paul's answers circled back to the same theme. They could have survived it all, if not for outside interference. He never named her outright in anger, but the implication was clear. He carried the bitterness quietly, letting it surface only in rare confessions. Yoko, for her part, never softened. She gave interviews that painted John as the genius and Paul as the sidekick. She suggested John had outgrown him, that the Beatles had been holding John back, that her presence had set him free. To Paul, it was salt in the wound. Every time she spoke, he felt diminished. He had poured his soul into the band, carried them when others drifted, written classics that would outlive them all. And yet, in Yoko's telling, he was the jealous partner who couldn't accept losing control. That narrative infuriated him. Still, Paul was careful. He knew the public adored John and sympathized with Yoko as the widow of a slain icon. Open hostility would only backfire. So he smiled, nodded, played the diplomat. But behind closed doors, friends say, he never forgave. The hatred stayed alive, not in daily outbursts, but in the quiet way he refused to give her credit, the way he rolled his eyes when her name came up, the way he avoided sharing stages unless duty demanded it. In 2023, during a reflective interview, Paul finally admitted the truth more openly than ever. He said what fans had long suspected. The Beatles never wanted her in the studio, never liked how she inserted herself, never accepted her role. It wasn't just awkward, it was destructive. And though decades had passed, the memory still stung. He didn't name it as hatred, but the words carried the weight of a man who had never healed. Even as he neared his 80s, Paul remained defined by love in the public eye. His concerts were filled with songs about hope, joy, resilience. He sang about peace and togetherness. But beneath it all was that one story he couldn't rewrite, that one bitterness he couldn't bury. The woman who sat beside John Lennon in 1968 had done more than annoy him. She had taken away the partnership that shaped his life, the friendship that had carried him through grief and loss, the brotherhood he thought would last forever. To Paul McCartney, Yoko Ono wasn't just John's partner. She was the symbol of everything he lost. And for all the songs, all the smiles, all the decades that passed, the truth was simple. He never forgave her. He hated her more than anyone. And that hatred, quiet but unshakable, remained the last unspoken chord of the Beatles' story.